Hello, and welcome to Lanternlight Chronicles. Tonight, let the day come quietly to its close. Let the cares of it loosen their hold, one by one, and slip away into the dark. Let your shoulders soften. Let your breathing slow and grow deep and even. And let me carry you far from here, across the sea and across 16 centuries of time, to a narrow finger of land where two continents almost touch, where the waters of the world flow past in a great blue current, and where one man once dreamed of building the most magnificent city that had ever been, and then, against all reason, did. Picture it now, in the gray stillness before dawn. You are standing at the very tip of a triangular peninsula, at the meeting place of the waters. Behind you the land rises gently in a row of low hills. Before you, and to your right, the sea stretches away wide and pale toward the growing light in the east. To your left, a long deep inlet curves inland like a great horn of calm water, sheltered and still, a perfect harbor made by no human hand. And directly across the swift channel ahead of you, so near that in the clear morning air you feel you could almost call out and be heard, lies another shore, another continent entirely, the coast of Asia catching the first pale gold of the rising sun. You are standing on the doorstep between two worlds, at the one place on all the earth where Europe and Asia lean close and gaze at one another across a ribbon of moving water. The air is cool and carries the smell of salt and seaweed and the faint smoke of early fires. Gulls wheel and cry over the water. A fishing boat slips quietly out into the current, its single sail hanging slack in the still air. And as the sun climbs higher behind the eastern hills, its light spills across the water and up the slopes before you, and you begin to see, rising along those hills, the shapes of a city unlike any other in the world. Great domes, soaring columns, palaces and churches, and towering walls of pale stone, tier upon tier, climbing from the water's edge up toward the sky, all of it catching the morning light and giving it back in gold. This is the city that the whole world would one day long to possess, the city that would be besieged more times than any other, and yet stand unconquered for 1,000 years, the city that men simply called, in the end, the city, as though there were no other worth naming. Tonight, we are going to watch it rise. We are going to ask how it came to be, this improbable capital at the edge of the world. We will begin long before its greatness, with a small colony of Greek settlers and an old, strange story about an oracle and a land of blind men. We will stand upon its extraordinary site and understand why this one narrow point of land was, perhaps, the most perfectly placed spot in all the world for a great city to grow. We will meet the emperor who chose it, a man of iron will who paced out its boundaries in the dust and refused to stop walking. We will watch him strip the whole of his empire of its treasures to adorn his new creation. And we will see the city fill with people and rise and become the beating heart of an empire. We will walk its mighty walls, the greatest fortifications the world had ever seen, and descend into the vast dark cisterns of water hidden beneath its streets. We will stand beneath the impossible floating dome of its greatest church. And we will understand at last why every ambitious people for 1,000 years looked upon this shining city and wanted it for their own. There is nothing you need to remember. There will be no test in the morning, and nothing here you must carry with you. If your thoughts begin to drift and wander, let them. If sleep comes for you before we reach the end of the story, then let it come, and welcome. That is exactly what this quiet hour is for. The city will still be rising in the dark, and I will still be here, telling its long story softly, whether you hear the end of it tonight or not. And if you find that these calm histories help to carry you down toward rest, you might gently tap the like button, and perhaps subscribe, so that more of them can find their way to you, and to others who lie awake in the dark and are looking for something quiet to hold on to. That is the only thing I will ask of you all evening. And now, let the modern world dissolve entirely, and let us go back across the centuries, to the very beginning, to a time when this magnificent place was nothing but a rocky point of land, an empty harbor, and a story waiting to happen. Long before there were emperors or domes or golden mosaics, there was only the site itself. And the first people to build here were not Romans, but Greeks. In the ancient world, the Greeks were the great colonizers of the seas, sending out expeditions from their crowded homeland to plant new cities all along the coasts of the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, wherever a good harbor and a defensible hill could be found. And around 2,600 years ago, so the old story goes, a band of these Greek settlers, led by a man named Byzas, came sailing up through these very waters, looking for a place to found a new home. Before they set out, as was the custom, they had journeyed to the great oracle at Delphi to ask the god where they should build their city. And the oracle, as oracles so often did, gave them an answer that was a riddle. Settle, it told them, opposite the land of the blind. The settlers puzzled over these strange words as they sailed, until at last they came to this meeting place of the waters, and there they understood. For on the far shore, across the channel, there already stood an earlier Greek colony, a town called Chalcedon, which had been founded some years before on the Asian side. And as Byzas and his people looked at the magnificent site on the European side, with its sheltered harbor and its commanding hills, and its perfect position astride the great sea route, they realized that the earlier settlers of Chalcedon must have been blind indeed, blind to have chosen their ordinary spot across the water when this far greater prize had lain here, empty, all along. So Byzas built his city on the better site, opposite the land of the blind, and he named it, after himself, Byzantium. And though it would grow, over the centuries, into the mightiest city in the world, and though its name would change more than once, that first Greek name would never be entirely forgotten, and the empire that one day ruled from these hills would be remembered by history as the Byzantine. Now, whether or not there was ever truly a man named Byzas, and whether or not the oracle ever spoke those exact words, the heart of the old story is simply true, and it is the key to everything that follows. The site was extraordinary. There was no better place in all the known world to build a great city, and to understand why we must look closely at the land and the water. For the whole destiny of the city was written in its geography from the very beginning. Imagine, then, the shape of the place from high above. Here the continents of Europe and Asia reach toward one another, and are separated only by a long, narrow, winding strait of deep water, a channel that runs between two great seas. To the north lies the Black Sea, that vast inland ocean fed by the great rivers of half a continent. To the south, beyond another narrow strait, lies the wide Mediterranean, and all the sea lanes of the classical world. And this single winding channel, running between them, is the only water passage that joins the two. Every ship that wished to sail from the Mediterranean into the Black Sea, and every ship that wished to come the other way, laden with the grain and furs and slaves and timber of the northern lands, had to pass through this one narrow strait. And the city stood upon its shore, at the very narrowest and most commanding point, its hand resting, in effect, upon the throat of one of the busiest sea routes in the world. That was the first great gift of the site. It controlled the passage between the seas. But there was more. The peninsula on which the city stood was shaped like a blunt triangle, thrusting out into the water, and this shape gave it enormous natural strength. On two of its three sides it was bounded by water, by the strait to the northeast and by the open sea to the south, so that no enemy could easily approach it from those directions. And along its northern edge ran that long, deep, curving inlet, the great sheltered harbor that would come to be called the Golden Horn, a finger of calm deep water reaching far inland, where whole fleets could ride safely at anchor, protected from every storm and from every enemy. A city needs a harbor, and here was one of the finest natural harbors on the face of the earth, deep and sheltered and vast, as though the land itself had been shaped to cradle the ships of a great power. So the site gave the city three things at once, and each of them was priceless. It gave command of the trade route between two seas, so that wealth would flow through it as naturally as the water flowed past its walls. It gave a magnificent, sheltered, defensible harbor. And it gave a position of tremendous natural strength, ringed on two sides by water, so that only along one landward edge could an enemy ever hope to attack. And that single edge, in time, would be sealed by the mightiest walls the world had ever seen. Command of trade, a perfect harbor, and near impregnable defenses, all in one place, all given freely by the shape of the land and the sea. It is no wonder that the oracle called the earlier settlers blind. It is no wonder that, once the wider world understood the value of this site, everyone who dreamed of empire would dream, sooner or later, of holding this one narrow point of land where the two continents meet. For a long time, though, the city of Byzantium remained only a modest place, a useful trading town, prosperous enough but not yet great, changing hands among the powers of the ancient world as the centuries rolled by. It was Greek, and then it fell within the orbit of Athens, and then of Sparta, and then at last, like nearly everything else around the shores of the Mediterranean, it came under the vast and growing power of Rome. And there it might have remained, a pleasant and profitable provincial town on the edge of the Roman world, had not the whole of that Roman world, in the fullness of time, been plunged into a crisis so deep that it would drive an emperor to look east, to this narrow point between the seas, and to see in it the answer to all his troubles, and the site of a new Rome. To understand how that came to pass, we must understand the trouble that Rome had fallen into. For centuries, the Roman Empire had been the greatest power the Western world had ever known, a vast dominion stretching from the misty island of Britain in the northwest to the deserts of Syria and Egypt in the southeast, all of it bound together by roads and law and the might of the legions, all of it looking to the ancient city of Rome as its center and its soul. But by the time we have now reached in our story, a little less than 300 years after the birth of Christ, that mighty empire had passed through a long and terrible age of crisis. Enemies pressed upon its frontiers from every side. Plagues swept through its cities. Its economy faltered. Its coinage lost its value. And worst of all, its own armies turned again and again upon the state, raising up one general after another as emperor and then cutting him down, so that in the space of a single troubled century Rome had been ruled, however briefly, by dozens of men, most of whom died by violence. The empire had very nearly torn itself apart. Out of this chaos there arose, at last, a succession of hard and capable soldier emperors who dragged the state back from the edge of ruin and set about reforming it from top to bottom. The greatest of these reformers understood a hard truth about the empire as it now stood. It had simply grown too large, and its threats too many and too scattered, for any one man in any one city to govern it all. And they understood something else as well. The old capital, the ancient city of Rome herself, for all her glory and her history, lay far away in the west, hundreds of miles from the frontiers where the real dangers now gathered, on the Rhine and the Danube in the north, and above all on the eastern border, where the mighty Persian Empire stood as Rome's great rival. An emperor who needed to lead his armies against these threats could not do so from Rome. He needed to be closer to the action, closer to the frontiers, closer to the strategic heart of things. And so the emperors of this age began, more and more, to rule not from Rome at all, but from other cities, closer to the borders, wherever the needs of war and government called them. The old capital was becoming slowly a place of memory and ceremony, honored but no longer truly the center of power. The center of power was drifting. It only wanted a man with the vision and the will to fix it, at last, in a single perfect place. That man was Constantine. He came into the world as the son of one of the leading soldiers of the empire, and he grew up in the hard school of the army and the court during those dangerous years of shared and shifting power. When his father died, Constantine's own soldiers proclaimed him emperor, but he was only one of several men who claimed that title in different parts of the empire, and the years that followed were years of civil war. As these rivals maneuvered and fought one another for supremacy, Constantine proved himself, through all of it, to be a commander of extraordinary boldness and skill. and a man of relentless ambition, patient when patience was needed, and swift and decisive when the moment came to strike. The most famous turning point of his rise came at a battle fought just outside the walls of Rome itself, at a crossing of the river Tiber called the Milvian Bridge. There Constantine faced a powerful rival for control of the western half of the empire. And there, according to the story that would be told ever afterward, something happened that changed not only Constantine's life, but the whole future course of the world. On the day before the battle, it was said, Constantine saw a sign in the sky, a blazing symbol of the Christian faith, and with it words that promised him victory. He ordered the sign to be painted upon the shields of his soldiers, and the next day he won a total and crushing victory, his rival drowning in the river as his army broke and fled. Constantine entered Rome as its master, and from that day forward he threw the whole weight of his power behind the Christian religion, which until then had been a persecuted and unlawful faith within the empire. Under Constantine, Christianity would rise from the shadows to become the favored religion of the Roman state, and in time the faith of the whole Roman world. Whatever truly happened in the sky above the Milvian Bridge, its consequences would echo down through all the centuries that followed, and the city Constantine was soon to build would be, from its very foundation, a Christian city, the first great capital of a Christian empire. But Constantine was not yet the sole ruler of the Roman world. In the eastern half of the empire there remained one last great rival, a hard and capable emperor named Licinius, and between these two men, the master of the West and the master of the East, an uneasy peace could not last forever. In time it broke, and the two emperors went to war for the whole of the Roman world. The struggle came to its climax here, in the very waters and hills of our story. Constantine defeated Licinius in a great battle on the European side, and Licinius fled across the water to the Asian shore, to the town of Chrysopolis, which stood almost directly opposite the old city of Byzantium. There, on the Asian side of the strait, in sight of the very peninsula where the new capital would soon rise, Constantine won the final victory that made him, at last, the sole master of the entire Roman Empire, the first man in a generation to hold undivided power over that whole vast world. And it was here, in the flush of that final triumph, standing victorious upon these shores, with the whole Roman world laid at his feet, that Constantine looked upon the old Greek city of Byzantium across the water, with its perfect harbor and its commanding hills, and its unrivaled position astride the passage between the seas, and conceived the great idea that would be his lasting monument. He would not rule from Rome, that beautiful and burdened ghost of the past. Far away in the west, he would build a new Rome here, at the meeting place of the continents, at the strategic heart of his reborn empire. He would take this ancient trading town and raise it up into a capital worthy of the whole Roman world. A city of his own making, bearing his own name. And so was born the idea of Constantinople, the city of Constantine. Constantine did not do things by halves. Once he had settled upon the site, he threw himself into the founding of his new capital with all the tremendous energy and will that had carried him to the mastery of the world. There is an old story told about the day he marked out the boundaries of the city, and whether or not it happened exactly so, it captures something true about the scale of his ambition. It was said that Constantine himself walked out on foot to trace the line where the new walls would run, pacing across the open ground beyond the old city, a spear in his hand, marking the boundary of his creation. And as he walked, further and further, taking in more and more land, far more than the old town had ever covered, his courtiers grew astonished at the vast circuit he was pacing out. And at last one of them dared to ask him how much further he meant to go. And Constantine answered, without stopping, that he would go on until the one who walked before him, unseen, chose to stop. It was as if he were being led by a hand greater than his own, marking out not merely a city, but a destiny, and drawing its bounds so wide that the town within them would have room to grow into the greatest city in the world. The work of building went forward at a furious pace, for Constantine wished to see his city rise in his own lifetime, and he poured into it the wealth and the labor of the whole empire. Thousands upon thousands of workmen were set to the task. Whole quarters were laid out, streets and squares and grand public buildings, palaces for the emperor and his court, a great senate house to mirror the one in old Rome, forums and colonnades and baths, and all the apparatus of a great Roman city. And because Constantine wished his new capital to be beautiful at once, to be magnificent from its very birth, rather than waiting centuries to accumulate its treasures as old Rome had done, he did something breathtaking in its boldness. He sent his agents out across the entire Roman world, to the ancient cities and famous sanctuaries of Greece and Asia and Egypt. And he had them gather up the finest works of art of the classical world, statues and columns and monuments beyond counting, the accumulated masterpieces of 1,000 years, and bring them all here, to adorn his new city. Constantinople was to be a treasury of the whole world's beauty, gathered into one place, and the empire was, in a sense, stripped to clothe it. So the new city rose, studded with the glories of the ancient world. In its great central forum, Constantine raised a mighty column of porphyry, that rare and precious purple stone reserved for emperors, and set his own statue upon its summit, gazing out over the city he had made. He built a vast arena for chariot racing, the Hippodrome, a long curving stadium where tens of thousands of citizens could gather to watch the races and to see and be seen by their emperor, and this Hippodrome he adorned with wonders brought from across the world. Among them an ancient bronze monument of 3 intertwined serpents that had stood for centuries at the holiest sanctuary of the Greeks, at Delphi, cast, so it was said, from the melted armor of a defeated Persian host long ages before. That ancient serpent monument, already old beyond memory when Constantine brought it here, would stand in his city through all the storms of the coming 1,000 years, and a part of it stands there still. One of the oldest things in a city full of old things, a silent witness to the whole vast sweep of the story. And Constantine gave his city one more echo of old Rome, deliberately and with meaning. Old Rome was famously built upon 7 hills, and Constantine's new capital, too, was said to rise upon 7 hills, as if to declare to all the world that here was Rome reborn, Rome made new, the true and rightful heir to all the glory and authority of the ancient capital. He called it New Rome, formally and officially, and though the world would come to know it by his own name, as Constantinople, the city of Constantine, that deeper claim was never forgotten. The people who lived here, through all the centuries to come, would call themselves not Byzantines, as we call them now, but Romans, for that is what they knew themselves to be. In their own eyes they were the Roman Empire, unbroken and continuing, simply ruling now from a new and greater Rome upon the Bosphorus. And in a very real sense they were right. For while the old city of Rome in the west would fall, in time, to invading barbarian kings, the Roman Empire itself did not fall with it. It lived on here, in this eastern capital, for another 1,000 years, so that the empire of Constantine outlasted the fall of old Rome by a span of time longer than separates us today from the great cathedrals of the Middle Ages. The dream of a new Rome was not a boast. It came true, and endured, on a scale that Constantine himself could scarcely have imagined. At last, after years of furious labor, the great work was ready, and in the year 330, Constantine dedicated his new capital in a series of magnificent ceremonies, with games and processions and prayers, formally consecrating the city and giving it into the keeping of God. From that day, Constantinople was a living capital, the seat of emperors, the center of a world. But a city, however grandly founded, is not made only of monuments and ceremonies. A city must be filled with people, and fed, and given water, and defended. And in the years and the centuries that followed Constantine's dedication, the raw new capital he had willed into being would have to grow into its destiny, drawing in the multitudes, raising the walls that would save it 100 times over, and becoming, at last, not merely a new Rome, but something wholly its own. the wonder and the envy of the world. To fill his city, Constantine and the emperors who followed him used every inducement they could devise, for a capital without people is only an empty stage. They offered land and houses to those who would come and settle. They summoned senators and nobles from old Rome and from across the empire, building them fine mansions and urging them to make their homes in the new capital. And above all, they gave the city the one thing that had always drawn the poor of the ancient world into the great cities and kept them there: bread. Just as old Rome had fed its citizens with free grain, so now the emperors arranged for the great grain fleets of Egypt, that immense harvest of wheat, grown in the rich black soil of the Nile Valley, to sail no longer to Rome, but here, to Constantinople, to feed the growing multitude of the new capital. A citizen of Constantinople could receive his daily bread as a gift of the emperor, and this simple, powerful magnet drew people in by the tens of thousands, the poor and the hopeful and the ambitious, all flowing toward the city where the bread was given out, and the great opportunities of the capital lay open. And so the city grew, and grew, with astonishing speed. Within a few generations of its founding, the raw new capital had swelled into one of the largest cities in the entire world, its population climbing toward the hundreds of thousands, a teeming, roaring metropolis of every people and tongue of the empire: Greeks and Romans, Syrians and Egyptians, Goths and Armenians, merchants and soldiers and priests and craftsmen and laborers, all crowded together within its walls, filling its streets and its markets and its churches and its great racecourse. The main avenue of the city, a broad colonnaded street running from the heart of the old town out toward the walls, became one of the grandest thoroughfares in the world, lined with shops and statues and shaded walkways, thronged from morning to night with the endless traffic of a capital. Constantinople had become, in a single lifetime and then a few more, exactly what Constantine had dreamed: a new Rome, a true capital, the equal and then the superior of the ancient city whose name and glory it had claimed. But a great and wealthy city, standing at the crossroads of the world and stuffed with the treasures of an empire, is also a great and tempting prize, and Constantinople had enemies, or would soon make them, on every side. To the north, beyond the Danube and around the shores of the Black Sea, roamed fierce and warlike peoples who looked with hungry eyes upon the wealth of the Roman world. To the east lay the mighty empire of Persia, Rome's ancient rival, ever ready to press upon the frontier. And in the centuries to come, new powers would arise, sweeping out of the deserts and the steppes with astonishing speed, and each of them, sooner or later, would turn its gaze upon the shining city between the seas and long to make it their own. If Constantinople was to survive, if it was to fulfill the destiny Constantine had marked out for it, it would need to be more than beautiful and more than rich. It would need to be strong. It would need to be, if such a thing were possible, unconquerable. And so the emperors gave their city the one thing that would, more than any other, secure its long life through all the storms of the coming 1,000 years. They gave it walls. The walls of Constantinople were, quite simply, the greatest fortifications that the ancient and medieval world ever produced, and they deserve to be understood. For it is no exaggeration to say that they saved the city, and with it the empire, again and again and again, across the centuries. On the two sides where the city faced the water, along the Strait and the Sea and the Golden Horn, it was protected by sea walls, and, more than that, by the sea itself, which no enemy could easily cross in the teeth of the city's fleets. But on the landward side, along the single edge of the triangle that faced the open country of Europe, the city lay exposed, and it was here, across this one vulnerable neck of land, that the emperors built the mightiest barrier of all. The greatest of these landward defenses was raised in the reign of a later emperor, a boy emperor named Theodosius II, under whose name the walls would ever afterward be known, though it was in truth the officials and engineers of his government who conceived and built them. They did not build a single wall, but a whole layered system of defense, a killing ground through which any attacker would have to fight, one deadly obstacle after another. First, before the walls even began, there was a broad, deep moat, which could be flooded with water. A wide, wet ditch that no siege tower or ram could cross. Behind the moat rose a low outer wall, with a walkway along its top for defenders. Behind that outer wall lay a terrace, and then rose the great inner wall, the main wall, enormously thick and high, studded along its length with tall towers set close together, from which the defenders could rain down arrows and stones and fire upon anyone caught in the ground below. An attacker who somehow crossed the flooded moat would find himself trapped between the outer and inner walls, in a narrow lane swept by fire from the towering defenses above, with the greatest wall of all still to come. It was a system of layered death, brilliantly designed, and it ran for miles across the landward side of the city, sealing it off entirely behind a barrier that, for 1,000 years, no enemy could break. It is difficult to overstate what these walls meant for the life of the city and of the empire. In an age when a determined enemy could sweep across whole provinces, sack cities, and topple kingdoms, Constantinople stood behind its triple barrier like a great ship, riding out storm after storm, battered but never sunk. Army after army came against it down through the centuries. Vast hosts of every people that rose to power around it, and again they broke upon those walls like waves upon a rock and fell back, defeated, having spent their strength for nothing. The walls gave the city, and the empire it ruled, a kind of deep security that few states in history have ever enjoyed, a knowledge that whatever disasters befell the provinces, whatever armies marched, and whatever frontiers fell, the heart of the empire, the capital itself, would endure. Behind those walls the emperors could rebuild shattered armies, gather their strength, and outlast their enemies, secure in the one fortress that could not be taken. For 1,000 years, this was the great fixed point of the Eastern world, the city that did not fall. And the walls were the reason. And the strength of the walls was matched by another, quieter kind of strength, one that lay hidden beneath the streets and was, in its own way, just as vital to the city's survival. For a fortress, however mighty its walls, can be starved, and it can be parched. An enemy who cannot break through the defenses can still sit down outside them and wait, cutting the city off from the outside world, hoping to force it to surrender through hunger and, above all, through thirst. Food could be stored, and could be brought in by sea as long as the city commanded the water. But water, fresh water for a population of hundreds of thousands, was a harder problem, and the peninsula on which the city stood had no great river, and no abundant springs of its own. So the emperors solved the problem of water as brilliantly as they had solved the problem of defense. And they did it in two ways, one reaching out far beyond the walls, and one reaching down beneath the city itself. Reaching outward, they built aqueducts, those marvels of ancient engineering. Long channels of stone that carried fresh water from distant springs and hills, sometimes from sources many miles away, running it across valleys on tall arched bridges and through the countryside on a gentle, ceaseless downward slope until it flowed at last into the city. One great aqueduct, raised under an emperor named Valens, strode across a valley in the heart of the city on a mighty double tier of arches, and a part of that great structure still stands today, its arches marching across the modern streets, carrying nothing now but the memory of the water that once flowed there to slake the thirst of the ancient capital. Through such aqueducts the city drank, in ordinary times, water carried to it from far away by the patient genius of Roman engineering. But an aqueduct, running for miles across the open country, was terribly vulnerable in time of war. An enemy besieging the city had only to find the aqueduct out in the countryside and break it, and the flow of water into the city would cease. And so the emperors did something extraordinary. They built, beneath the streets and squares of the city, a vast hidden world of underground reservoirs. Enormous covered cisterns, great subterranean halls with roofs held up by forests of columns, and they filled these with water in times of peace, storing up beneath the city an immense reserve against the day of siege. The grandest of these underground cisterns was built in a later age, in the reign of the Emperor Justinian. And to descend into it even now is to enter a place of eerie and unearthly beauty. A great echoing cavern beneath the city, its still black water stretching away into the darkness, its roof upheld by hundreds of tall columns, rising like the pillars of a drowned and silent temple. The whole vast space cool and dim and utterly quiet, far below the noise and light of the streets above. In these hidden cisterns the city stored its life. When an enemy cut the aqueducts, as enemies did, the city simply drew upon the great reserves hidden beneath its own streets, and drank, and endured, and waited for its foes to weary and depart. Between the walls that could not be broken, the sea that could not be crossed, the grain fleets that fed it, and the hidden waters stored beneath it, Constantinople had been made, as nearly as any city in history has ever been made, unconquerable, and behind those defenses, secure at the center of the world, it grew rich and splendid beyond the dreams of ordinary men. Of all the emperors who shaped the city in its early centuries, none left a deeper mark upon it than Justinian, who ruled some 200 years after Constantine had founded the capital, and who dreamed on a scale as vast as Constantine's own. Justinian was a man of boundless ambition and tireless energy, who wished to restore the Roman Empire to its ancient greatness, to reconquer the lost western provinces, to reform its laws, and to raise its capital to new heights of splendor. He was aided in all of this by his empress, Theodora, a woman of remarkable intelligence and iron nerve, who had risen from the humblest and most disreputable of origins to share the throne, and who would, at the most dangerous moment of Justinian's reign, prove herself braver and more resolute than any of the men around her. That dangerous moment came early, and it very nearly swept Justinian from the throne and into his grave, and it is worth telling, because out of its ashes rose the greatest building the city would ever know. The people of Constantinople were passionately, furiously devoted to the chariot races in the great hippodrome, and they were divided into rival factions. Known by the colors their favored teams wore, the blues and the greens, whose rivalry ran far beyond mere sport and spilled over into the politics and the street life of the whole city. Ordinarily the blues and the greens hated one another, but on one terrible occasion their fury turned instead upon the emperor himself, and the two factions united in a sudden, violent uprising against Justinian and his government. The rioters ran wild through the city, and their rallying cry was a single word that meant conquer or win, shouted in the hippodrome, so that the whole terrible episode would be remembered ever after by that word, the Nika riots. For days the mob raged and burned. Much of the city center was set ablaze and reduced to ruins. The rioters proclaimed a rival emperor and prepared to storm the palace. And Justinian, hemmed in and despairing, made ready to flee, to abandon the city and the throne, and escape by ship across the water with his life. It was then that Theodora spoke. When the emperor and his counselors had all but decided to run, the empress rose and refused to go. Far better, she is remembered as having said, to stand and die an emperor than to live as a fugitive. Power, she declared, was a fine burial shroud, and she would not flee. Shamed and stiffened by her resolve, Justinian and his generals turned to fight. They led loyal troops into the packed hippodrome where the rebels had gathered, and there, in a single day of appalling slaughter, they crushed the uprising utterly, and the revolt was over. Justinian's throne was saved. But the heart of his city lay in ashes, and among the ruins was the great church that had stood at the center of Constantinople since the early days, burned to the ground in the fury of the riots. And Justinian, secure once more upon his throne, resolved that in place of the burned church he would build something the world had never seen before, a church so vast and so magnificent that it would proclaim, for all ages, the glory of God and the glory of his empire. He would build the Hagia Sophia, the Church of the Holy Wisdom. What Justinian's architects raised, in an astonishingly short span of only a few years, was one of the supreme achievements of human building. a structure so daring and so beautiful that it would stand for 1,000 years as the greatest church in all of Christendom, and would astonish every soul who entered it. The genius of the Hagia Sophia lay in its dome. The builders raised, over the vast central space of the church, an enormous dome of brick, so wide and so shallow, and set so high upon its supports, that it seemed to defy all reason and all weight. And they contrived, by a subtle and brilliant device, to pierce the base of that great dome all the way around with a ring of windows, so that when a worshipper stood far below and looked up, the dome appeared not to rest upon solid walls at all, but to float, unsupported, upon a circle of pure light, hovering in the air above the church as though suspended from heaven itself by a golden chain. The entire interior was sheathed in colored marble and shimmering gold mosaic, so that in the light of thousands of lamps and candles, the whole vast space glowed and glittered like the inside of a jewel, and the golden dome seemed to hang above it all, in radiant, impossible light. When it was finished, and Justinian entered his great church for the first time, he is remembered to have looked upon what he had made, and to have thought of the most famous builder of the sacred in all the ancient tradition, the wise King Solomon of old, who had built the great temple of Jerusalem. And Justinian, gazing up into that floating dome, is said to have cried out that he had surpassed him. "Solomon," he exclaimed, "I have outdone thee." Whether he spoke those exact words or not, they capture the wonder of the thing. For centuries afterward, travelers and ambassadors and pilgrims who came to Constantinople from every corner of the world would be brought into the Hagia Sophia, and they would stand beneath that impossible dome, in that glittering ocean of gold and marble and light, and they would be struck dumb with awe, feeling, as one group of them would later famously report to their distant prince, that they no longer knew whether they stood on the earth or in heaven. The Hagia Sophia became the very soul of the city, the wonder at its heart, and it stands there yet, its great dome still floating above the ancient capital after nearly 1,500 years. One of the most beautiful things that human hands have ever made. Justinian's reign left the city more than its greatest church, for this was an emperor who wished to set the whole Roman world in order, and one of the works he commanded would prove, in its own quiet way, as lasting as the dome of the Hagia Sophia itself. The laws of the Roman Empire had grown, over the long centuries, into a vast and tangled thicket, a chaos of ancient statutes and imperial decrees, and the opinions of generations of jurists, so heaped up and so contradictory that no one could easily find or follow them. And so Justinian gathered the finest legal minds of his age and set them to a monumental task, to sift through the whole enormous inheritance of Roman law, to cut away what was obsolete and contradictory, and to gather what remained into a single, clear, ordered body of law that could serve the empire and stand for all time. The result was a great collection of the Roman law, distilled and arranged and set down in an orderly form, and it proved to be one of the most influential achievements in the whole history of human governance. For long after the emperor who commanded it was gone, this codification of the Roman law would be rediscovered and studied and taken up in the West, and it would become the very foundation upon which the legal systems of a great part of the world would later be built. The principles of law under which many millions of people live to this day flow, in part, from the work done by those scholars in Constantinople, at the command of Justinian, 1,500 years ago. It is a strange and wonderful thing to consider, that a city so famous for its walls and its domes and its gold should also have sent out into the world, so quietly, a gift as enduring as the very idea of ordered law. Justinian dreamed, too, of restoring the old Roman Empire to its full ancient extent, of winning back the western provinces that had been lost to the barbarian kings. And for a time his brilliant generals did just that, reconquering Italy and North Africa and a corner of Spain, so that once again, however briefly, the Mediterranean was very nearly a Roman sea, ruled from Constantinople. But such vast ambitions came at a terrible cost in blood and treasure, and the reconquered lands would not long be held. And in the midst of his reign there fell upon the empire a catastrophe against which no army and no wall could defend. A great plague that swept through the city and the whole Mediterranean world, carrying off, it was said, a vast portion of the population, emptying streets that had teemed with life, and darkening the golden age of the great emperor with an immense and unstoppable sorrow. It is a sobering reminder, woven through the glory of Justinian's age, that even the mightiest city the world had ever seen, secure behind its unbreakable walls, could not close its gates against every enemy, and that the story of Constantinople, for all its triumphs, was always also a story of endurance through suffering, of a people who met disaster after disaster and yet, somehow, carried on. With its walls and its waters, its churches and its palaces, Constantinople grew, through the long centuries of the early Middle Ages, into the greatest, richest, and most sophisticated city in the whole of the Christian world, and indeed one of the greatest cities anywhere on earth. While in the far west, after the fall of old Rome, the cities had shrunk, and the great buildings had crumbled, and much of the old learning had been lost. Here in the east, the light of Roman civilization burned on, unbroken, gathered and concentrated in this one shining capital. To a traveler coming from the small towns and timber halls of Western Europe, Constantinople must have seemed almost unimaginable. A vision from a dream. A city of 500,000 souls or more, of stone and marble and gold, of vast domed churches and thronging markets and palaces heaped with treasure. At a time when the greatest lord in the West might live in a draughty hall and count a few thousand subjects, a mighty following. There was, quite simply, nothing else like it in the world these travelers knew. Its wealth flowed, above all, from its position, from that command of the trade routes that the site had promised from the very beginning. Everything passed through Constantinople. The goods of the north came down through the Black Sea and the Straits. Furs, and honey, and wax, and timber, and slaves from the great forests and rivers of the lands beyond. The goods of the east came overland along the ancient roads and by sea through distant ports, spices and gems and perfumes, and above all silk, that shimmering precious fabric whose secret the far-off empire of the Chinese had guarded for ages, and which was worth, weight for weight, a fortune. For a long time the people of Constantinople could only buy silk from distant middlemen at enormous cost. But in time, so the story goes, the secret of the silkworm itself was smuggled into the city, hidden, it was said, within a hollow staff, and the empire began to weave its own silk in imperial workshops whose finest and most gorgeous products, dyed in the rare and costly imperial purple, were reserved for the emperor alone and forbidden to any other. The markets of the city overflowed with the wealth of 3 continents, and the customs duties on all this trade, the tolls taken as the goods of the world flowed through the city's hands, filled the imperial treasury with a river of gold, and made the empire, for centuries, the wealthiest state in the Western world. And at the center of all this wealth and splendor stood the emperor, and the court that surrounded him, wrapped in a ceremony so elaborate and so magnificent that it was designed, quite deliberately, to overwhelm the beholder, and to place the emperor almost beyond the reach of ordinary humanity. The ruler of Constantinople was no mere king. He was held to be the chosen regent of God upon the earth, the living link between heaven and the empire, and everything about his court was arranged to express that awesome dignity. Ambassadors admitted to the imperial presence would pass through halls of dazzling richness, past ranks of courtiers in gorgeous robes, to prostrate themselves before a throne heaped with gold. There were, it was said, marvelous mechanical devices in the great throne room, golden trees in whose branches sat golden birds that sang, and golden lions beside the throne that could roar and beat the ground with their tails, and the throne itself could be raised aloft, so that a visitor who bowed low before the seated emperor might look up to find him, lifted high above, robed now in different splendor, as if transported by a power not of this world. All of this ceremony, all this gold and silk and cunning artifice, served a purpose. It proclaimed to every visitor, and to every subject, that this city and its ruler stood at the very summit of the world, touched by the divine, the heir of Rome, and the chosen of God, the center around which the whole of Christendom turned. The life of the ordinary people of the city, meanwhile, went on in the streets below the palaces, loud and various and intensely alive. They crowded the great markets and the harbors. They packed the hippodrome to roar for the blues or the greens. Indeed, no single thing bound the people of the city together, or divided them. Quite like the chariot races. And to understand the daily passions of Constantinople, one must understand the hippodrome and the fever it stirred. On race days the whole city seemed to empty into that vast curving stadium. Tens of thousands of citizens packing the tiers of stone seats, the rich and the poor, the great and the humble, all crowded together in a single roaring mass beneath the open sky. Below them, on the long sanded track, the chariots would line up behind the starting gates, each drawn by its team of straining horses, each driver in the colors of his faction. And when the signal was given and the gates flew open, the chariots would burst forth and go thundering around the track, wheel to wheel, hurtling around the tight turns at either end where the greatest danger lay, where a chariot might clip the barrier or tangle with another and be smashed to splinters, the driver flung across the sand or dragged behind his horses. Lap after lap they raced, while the crowd rose to its feet and roared, faction against faction, the blues screaming for their champions and the greens for theirs. The noise rolling out across the city like the sound of the sea in a storm. The passion for the races ran so deep that the factions of the blues and the greens became far more than mere clubs of sports enthusiasts. They were woven into the very life of the city, with their own organizations and loyalties and rivalries, and they took on a weight in the politics of the capital that no mere game should ever have carried. A victorious charioteer could become the idol of the whole city, showered with wealth and honor, his statue raised among the monuments of the hippodrome, his name remembered like that of a great general. And the emperor himself sat among his people at the races, in his royal box high above the track, watching the same contest and sharing the same excitement. So that the hippodrome became one of the few places where the ruler of the world came face to face with the mass of his ordinary subjects, where the people could cheer him, or petition him, or, on rare and dangerous occasions, turn their fury against him. It was a place of joy and spectacle and release, where the whole city came together to forget its cares for an afternoon in the thunder of the hooves and the roar of the crowd, and it was, at the same time, the beating pulse of the city's public life, the great arena where the moods and the passions of the people of Constantinople rose to their height beneath the open sky. They filled the countless churches, for this was a deeply and passionately religious city, whose people argued the fine points of theology in the marketplace and the bathhouse with a fervor that astonished outsiders, and whose calendar was woven through with the great festivals and processions of the faith. On holy days the streets would fill with solemn processions, the clergy in their vestments, the sacred images and relics carried aloft, the chanting rising between the walls, the whole city turning out to honor its God and to beseech the protection of the Holy Mother, whom the people of Constantinople held to be the special guardian and defender of their city. For they believed, and not without reason, that their city was watched over and preserved by heaven itself, and that so long as they kept the faith, the walls would hold, and the enemy would be turned back, and the city would endure. Time and again, across the centuries, that faith would be put to the ultimate test, as army after army came against the great walls, and time and again, against every expectation, the city would be saved. Let us dwell for a while on those great sieges, for they are the very heart of the city's story, the proving of everything that Constantine and his heirs had built. To understand them, imagine what it was to be an enemy commander gazing upon Constantinople for the first time, having marched a great army across half a world to take it. You come at last over the last low hills to the west, and there before you the city reveals itself, and your heart sinks even as your ambition burns. Across the whole neck of the peninsula stretches that triple line of walls, the flooded moat glinting, the outer wall, the terrace, and behind it the great towered inner wall, rising sheer and grim, mile upon mile of it, bristling with defenders. On either side, where the walls meet the water, the sea stretches away, patrolled by the emperor's fleets, so that you cannot simply go around. You must break through that landward barrier, or you must starve the city out, and the city, you know, is fed by the sea and watered from hidden reserves, and holds provisions enough to outlast your patience. Many a proud commander stood where you now stand, and marched away again in the end, with nothing but the bones of his army left behind him on that fatal ground. The most terrible tests came when a wholly new power exploded onto the stage of the world. Out of the deserts of Arabia there arose, with breathtaking speed, a new faith and a new empire. And within a single lifetime, the armies of the Arabs had conquered vast stretches of the old Roman and Persian worlds, sweeping across Syria and Egypt and North Africa and Persia in a tide of conquest that seemed unstoppable. And inevitably, that tide came at last to the walls of Constantinople. For whoever ruled this city held the gate between the continents, and the new empire meant to have it. Twice, in great and famous sieges separated by some 40 years, the full might of the Arab world was hurled against the city, by land, and above all by sea. With mighty fleets meant to overwhelm the defenders and force the straits. Twice the city stood at the very edge of its fate, with the survival not only of itself but, many later believed, of the whole Christian world hanging upon whether those walls would hold. And it was in these desperate sea sieges that the defenders of Constantinople unleashed their most famous and most terrifying weapon. A weapon so effective and so dreaded that its very secret became one of the most closely guarded mysteries of the empire. It was a kind of liquid fire, a burning substance that the Byzantines could spray from tubes mounted on the prows of their ships, sending a jet of flame roaring across the water onto the enemy vessels. And this fire, horrifyingly, could not be put out with water. It clung, and it burned, and it spread across the surface of the sea itself, turning the enemy fleets into floating pyres, consuming ships and men alike in a horror of flame no sailor could withstand. The world would come to call it Greek fire, and its exact composition was such a jealously kept secret of the state that it has never, to this day, been entirely rediscovered. Whatever it truly was, its effect was decisive. Again and again it shattered the fleets that came against the city, breaking the great sieges upon the water, even as the walls broke them upon the land. Between the walls and the fire and the sea and the sheer stubborn endurance of the defenders, the mightiest efforts of the greatest powers of the age were turned back from Constantinople, and the city that all the world wanted remained, against every expectation, unconquered. Think of what that endurance meant, not only for the city, but for the whole shape of history. Had Constantinople fallen in those early centuries, the entire course of the world would have run differently. The city was the great shield of the eastern flank of Europe, the fortress that stood in the path of every power that sought to push westward from Asia, and behind its shelter the lands and peoples of Europe were given the long centuries they needed to grow and develop in relative safety. Every army that spent itself against those walls was an army that did not march on into the west. The people of Constantinople may not have thought of themselves in such grand terms. They thought they were simply defending their homes, their families, their faith, and their emperor. But in defending their city, they were, without knowing it, holding a door against the storms of history. And the fact that they held it for so long, 1,000 years and more, is one of the great and underappreciated facts of the human past. The impossible city did not merely rise. It stood and went on standing, through siege after siege and century after century, long after the rest of the ancient world had passed away. And with each siege survived, each enemy turned back. The legend of the city only grew. Word of its wealth, and its wonders, and its seemingly miraculous survival spread to every corner of the known world, carried by merchants and pilgrims, and defeated soldiers, and returning ambassadors. Constantinople became, in the imagination of the whole medieval world, the Golden City, the Queen of Cities, the place where the wealth of the earth was gathered, and where God himself was said to watch over the walls. And that reputation, that shimmering image of unimaginable riches and beauty and holiness, drew the eyes of every ambitious people and every hungry power toward the shores of the Bosphorus, until it seemed that the whole world, in one way or another, wanted the city for its own. There was, in the hearts of the people of Constantinople, a deep and abiding belief that carried them through all these terrors. A conviction that their city was not defended by its walls alone, but by heaven itself, and above all by the Holy Mother of God, whom they honored as the special guardian and protectress of the capital. In times of danger, when an enemy host gathered before the walls, the people would take their most sacred relics and their holiest images, and they would carry them in solemn procession along the ramparts, chanting and praying, beseeching the protection of the Virgin over the city and its people. And more than once, when a great siege was lifted and the enemy turned away in defeat, the people believed with all their hearts that it was she who had saved them, that the Mother of God had spread her protecting veil over the city and shielded it from harm. There is a famous hymn of thanksgiving, sung in the city ever afterward, that arose from one such deliverance, when a mighty siege by land and sea was broken, and the people gathered in the great churches to give thanks to their heavenly defender for the salvation of the city. To the people of Constantinople, their city was a holy place, chosen and guarded by God. And this faith was not a small thing. It was the very spirit that steeled them to endure siege after siege across the centuries. The deep confidence that so long as they kept faith, their city could not truly fall. The religious life of the city was woven through every day and every season, and the great festivals of the church were the grandest and most beloved events of the whole year. On the holy days, the streets would fill with vast and solemn processions. The patriarch and the clergy in their gorgeous vestments, the emperor himself walking among them in humility, the sacred images and the relics of the saints carried aloft beneath canopies of silk and gold, the whole city turning out to follow. The air thick with incense and loud with the deep, unearthly chanting that rose and echoed between the walls. The people would process from church to church across the city, and the greatest of these gatherings would end beneath the floating dome of the Hagia Sophia, in that vast glittering space where heaven seemed to touch the earth. For this was, above all else, a city of faith, a city that believed itself to stand at the very center of God's design for the world. The New Jerusalem, the holy capital of a Christian empire, and that belief gave its people a strength and a unity and an endurance that no purely earthly city could ever have matched. It was faith, as much as stone, that held the walls of Constantinople. Among the many peoples drawn toward the great city, some of the most striking came from the far north. Down the long rivers that run from the cold forests of the Slavic lands toward the Black Sea. These were the Rus, warriors and traders of Scandinavian blood who had pushed south and east into the river country, and who now came down those waterways in their long boats, seeking the fabulous wealth of the city they called, in their own tongue, simply the great city. They came sometimes to trade, bringing furs and honey and wax and amber down to the markets of Constantinople, and carrying back silk and silver and the luxuries of the south. But they came sometimes to raid as well, sweeping down out of the north in their fleets to fall upon the shores near the city. And more than once these fierce northern warriors appeared, to the horror of the citizens. In the very waters before the walls, there is an old story, treasured in the north, that one of their princes, having brought his fleet to the city and won from it a favorable treaty, nailed his shield to the gate of Constantinople as a sign of his triumph, a boast from the edge of the world flung at the greatest city in it. In time, the relationship between the northerners and the city settled into something deeper and more remarkable than either trade or war. So impressed were the emperors by the strength and the loyalty of these northern fighting men that they began to take them into their own service, and there grew up within the imperial court an elite corps of guards drawn from these Norse and Rus warriors, and later from other northern peoples as well, a body of towering, axe-bearing soldiers who became the personal guard of the emperor himself. They were famed throughout the empire for their fearsome appearance, their great battle axes, their prodigious loyalty, and their fondness for drink, and they served the emperors faithfully through many a crisis. The far-traveled sons of the cold north standing guard, in their strange and distant service, over the sacred person of the ruler of the Romans. It is one of the many wonders of the city's story, that men born in the frozen forests at the edge of the world should end their days as the trusted guardians of the golden throne of Constantinople. But the deepest and most lasting influence that the city cast upon the peoples around it was not through trade or war, or even through the service of its guards. It was through its faith. For Constantinople was not only the political and commercial capital of the Eastern world, it was its spiritual capital as well, the great center of Eastern Christianity. And from it there flowed outward, across the centuries, a mighty tide of religion and culture that would shape whole nations and echo down to our own day. The churchmen of the city sent out missionaries to the pagan peoples beyond the frontiers. And the greatest of these missionaries, two brothers remembered as apostles to the Slavs, undertook a task of extraordinary consequence, finding that the Slavic peoples to whom they preached had no written language of their own. They created one for them, devising an alphabet in which the Slavic tongue could at last be written down, so that the scriptures and the liturgy and the learning of the church could be given to these peoples in their own language. From that act of scholarly devotion descended the family of alphabets, in which a great part of the Slavic world writes to this very day, so that the letters used now by many millions of people trace their origin back to the missionary zeal of the churchmen of Constantinople. And through such missions, one people after another was drawn into the spiritual world of the great city, adopting its faith, its liturgy, its art, and its script, and looking to Constantinople ever after as the mother of their Christianity. The most famous of all these conversions was that of the Rus themselves, whose ruler, so the cherished old chronicle tells us, sent out emissaries to examine the great faiths of the world before deciding which his people should embrace. His envoys visited the worship of many peoples, and found each of them wanting, until they came at last to Constantinople, and were brought into the Hagia Sophia to witness the divine service beneath its floating dome. And there, surrounded by the shimmering gold, and the clouds of incense, and the soaring chant, standing in that vast and glittering space where the great dome seemed to hang unsupported upon its ring of light, they were so overwhelmed with wonder that, as they later reported to their prince, they no longer knew whether they stood upon the earth or in heaven, and they knew only that there, surely, God dwelt among men. On the strength of that report, so the story goes, the ruler of the Rus led his whole people into the Eastern faith, binding the vast lands of the north to the church, and the culture of Constantinople, in a union that would endure and shape a great civilization for 1,000 years. Through such moments, the influence of the city reached out far beyond its walls, beyond its trade and its armies, into the very souls of nations, so that Constantinople became the mother city not of one people, but of many, the radiant center from which faith and letters and art flowed outward across half a world. Let us pause now in the telling, and simply walk for a while through the city at the height of its glory, in the way of a quiet dream, with nothing to learn and nowhere we must be, only the streets and the light and the sounds of the greatest city in the world unfolding gently around us. Come then, in through one of the great gates in the landward walls, through the shadow of that mighty barrier, and out into the city itself. Before you runs the main avenue, the great colonnaded street that is the spine of the whole capital, broad and paved and lined on either side with covered walkways where the sun is softened to a warm shade. It runs from the walls all the way to the heart of the old city by the water, and along its length lie the great forums. The wide public squares adorned with columns and statues and triumphal arches, each one a place of gathering and commerce and display. Walk slowly down this great street, and let the life of the city move around you. The covered walkways on either side are lined with the shops of the craftsmen and the merchants, and each trade has its own quarter, so that here you pass the workers in silver and gold, their little hammers tapping, the lamplight catching on their delicate work. And there the sellers of perfumes and spices, whose stalls send out clouds of fragrance into the street. Cinnamon and pepper, and frankincense, and the sweet oils of the East. Here are the silk merchants, with their bolts of shimmering cloth in every color, the precious purple kept apart and guarded, reserved for the emperor alone. Here are the sellers of books, and of candles, and of bread, and of fish fresh from the teeming waters that surround the city. The street is thronged with people of every land and station, great lords in their gorgeous robes with their retinues about them, monks and priests in their dark habits, sailors and soldiers, water sellers and porters, fine ladies veiled and attended, children darting through the crowd, the whole vast human tide of the capital flowing endlessly up and down the great avenue beneath the colonnades. Come down toward the water now, toward the point of the peninsula where the old heart of the city lies. Here, gathered close together, stand the greatest of all its wonders. Here is the vast open space of the hippodrome, the great racecourse, its long curved track able to hold a crowd of tens of thousands, adorned down its central spine with the marvels gathered from across the world, the ancient bronze serpents from Delphi, tall obelisks brought from Egypt, statues of gods and heroes and champions of the games. When the races are run, the whole city pours into this place, and the roar of the crowd rises into the sky. And the emperor himself watches from his box, connected by a private passage to the great palace that lies just beyond. And there beside the hippodrome rises the palace itself, not a single building, but a whole walled city of its own, a labyrinth of halls and courtyards and gardens and chapels, tumbling down toward the sea, glittering with gold and marble, the dwelling place of the ruler of the Romans and the beating heart of the empire's power. And above it all, crowning the whole city, rises the great dome of the Hagia Sophia, floating over the rooftops, catching the light. Step within, out of the noise and glare of the streets, and the world changes utterly. The vast interior opens around you, cool and dim and immense, and as your eyes adjust you begin to see the gold. The acres of golden mosaic, covering the high vaults and gleaming softly in the light of 1,000 hanging lamps, and the many-colored marbles sheathing the walls, green and purple and rose and white, veined and polished until they shine. The air is heavy with incense, and alive with the deep, unearthly sound of chanting, rising and falling and echoing in the great space. And when you lift your eyes at last to the dome, high above, and see it seem to float there upon its ring of light, weightless and radiant, hovering over the whole shimmering space as though hung from heaven, you understand in an instant why the envoys of the Rus felt they had left the earth behind. There is nowhere else in the world like this. There is no other city that gathers into one place such wealth, such beauty, such holiness, such wonder. This is Constantinople at its height, the queen of cities, the city the whole world wanted, and now, having walked its streets and stood beneath its dome, we may perhaps begin to understand why. There is another treasure the city held, quieter than its gold, and less visible than its domes, and yet in the long reckoning of history, perhaps more precious than any of them. For Constantinople was the great keeper of the memory of the ancient world. When the western half of the Roman Empire had fallen, and its cities had shrunk, and much of the learning of classical antiquity had been lost or forgotten in the West, here in the East the old knowledge was preserved. The people of Constantinople were the direct heirs of the Greeks and the Romans, and they never lost their connection to that ancient inheritance. In the libraries and the schools and the monasteries of the city, generation after generation of scholars and scribes copied and studied and preserved the great works of the classical past, the poems of Homer, and the dialogues of the philosophers, the plays of the ancient dramatists, and the histories of the old historians, the treatises of the mathematicians, and the physicians, and the astronomers. Much of what we know today of the literature and the thought of ancient Greece survived only because it was copied and cherished across the long centuries by the patient hands of the scribes of Constantinople and the lands within its cultural sphere. Think of what that means. Somewhere in the city, through all the sieges and the riots and the turning of the centuries, there were quiet rooms where learned men bent over their desks, carefully copying out, letter by letter, the words of authors who had died more than 1,000 years before, keeping their voices alive across an unimaginable gulf of time. Without that patient, unglamorous labor, so much of the wisdom and the beauty of the ancient world would simply have vanished from the earth, lost forever. But it was not lost. It was kept, here in the great city, safe behind the walls that would not fall, and in the fullness of time, when the West was ready to receive it again, this preserved inheritance would flow back into Western Europe and help to kindle the great rebirth of learning that we remember as the Renaissance. The scholars of Constantinople, carrying their precious manuscripts, would bring the living memory of ancient Greece to the cities of the West, and the seeds of that ancient wisdom, kept alive so long in the city between the seas, would flower again in a new age. So the city was not only a fortress, and a marketplace, and a holy place. It was a great vessel, carrying the treasure of the classical past safely across the dark and dangerous centuries, so that it might reach the future undrowned. And running through the whole long life of the city, beneath the grandeur and the wealth and the learning, there was the endless human drama of the throne itself. For Constantinople was the seat of power, and power drew to it all the ambition and the intrigue and the passion of which human beings are capable. The history of the emperors is a history as rich and as turbulent as any the world has known. A vast tapestry of great rulers and weak ones, of soldier emperors who saved the state, and scholar emperors who wrote books, of wise administrators and cruel tyrants, of usurpers who seized the throne by violence and dynasties that held it for generations. There were emperors who came to power in glory and died in disaster, and emperors who rose from nothing to rule the world. There were empresses who wielded power in their own right, formidable women, who governed the empire with a skill and a ruthlessness equal to any man's. The palace saw murder and blinding and exile, plots and counterplots. Sudden falls from the heights of power to the darkness of a monastery cell or a dungeon. It was a hard and dangerous world, that glittering court, where the distance from the golden throne to a violent death could be measured in a single night. And yet, through all the changes of ruler and dynasty, through all the murders and the coups and the shifting fortunes of the throne, the empire itself endured, and the city went on. That was the deep and abiding strength of Constantinople, that it was greater than any of the men and women who ruled it, that the machinery of the state and the walls of the city and the faith of the people carried on, generation after generation, whatever befell the individual on the throne. Emperors rose and fell like the waves of the sea, but the city stood, as it had stood since Constantine paced out its boundaries in the dust, the fixed and shining center of the Eastern world, enduring through everything, the one great constant amid all the turning wheels of fortune. There was yet another kind of treasure gathered in the city, one that mattered as much to the medieval mind as gold or silk, and that drew pilgrims and princes toward Constantinople with a longing all its own. For the great city had become, over the centuries, the supreme treasury of the holy relics of the Christian faith, the place where the most sacred objects of Christendom were gathered and kept and venerated. From the earliest days, the emperors and the people had labored to bring to their capital the precious physical remnants of the sacred story. And by the height of its glory, the city held a collection of relics without equal anywhere on earth. Here were kept, it was believed, fragments of the very cross on which Christ had died, sought out and recovered. So the tradition held, by the mother of Constantine himself in the Holy Land. Here were the bones and relics of countless saints and apostles and martyrs, brought from every corner of the Christian world to rest in the churches of the capital. Here were objects associated with the Virgin, and other holy things beyond counting, each one housed in its own shrine, wrapped in gold and silk, displayed on its feast day to crowds of awestruck worshippers. To the faithful of the whole Christian world, this made Constantinople not merely a rich and mighty city, but a holy one, a place where the sacred was gathered and made present, a destination of pilgrimage, a city where one could stand in the presence of the holiest objects of the faith. And this holiness, this concentration of the sacred, only deepened the longing that the wider world felt for the city. For to possess Constantinople was, in a sense, to possess the very heart of Christendom, to hold in one's hands the treasures upon which the faith of an age was focused. It is one of the sorrows of the city story that this same veneration would one day help to draw the greed of Christian armies down upon it, and that many of these sacred treasures would in the end be carried off to the churches and the cathedrals of the West. But in the long centuries of the city's greatness, its relics were among its supreme glories, a spiritual wealth that stood beside its material wealth and its beauty, and made Constantinople, in the eyes of the whole medieval world, a city touched by heaven, unique upon the earth, desirable beyond all others. The sense that here, in this one place, were gathered the wealth of the world, the beauty of the world, and the holiness of the world, all together behind those unbreakable walls, is perhaps the deepest reason of all, that the city was so endlessly, so achingly wanted. We have spoken much of the walls, but we should not forget the sea. For Constantinople was, above all things, a city of the water, cradled by it on every side but one. And the sea was as much a part of its life and its strength as the great stone barrier on the land. Return in your mind to that long, deep, curving inlet on the northern side of the city, the sheltered harbor that men called the Golden Horn, and imagine it as it was, crowded with the shipping of the world. Here rode the great merchant vessels come from every port of the known seas, their holds heavy with grain and wine and oil and silk and every good thing. And here, too, rode the war galleys of the imperial fleet, long and lean and swift, the guardians of the straits. The waters of the Horn were deep enough to bring the largest ships right up to the shore, and along its banks stretched the wharves and the warehouses and the shipyards, loud with the work of loading and unloading, of building and repairing. The whole maritime life of a great trading capital gathered in this one magnificent, sheltered basin. And because the harbor was so precious, the city guarded its mouth with a device as clever as it was simple. Across the entrance to the Golden Horn, from the point of the city to the shore on the far side, the defenders could stretch a great chain, an immense barrier of heavy iron links floating upon rafts of wood. And when this chain was raised and drawn taut across the harbor mouth, no enemy ship could pass into the sheltered waters beyond. The whole fleet of the empire could lie safe behind it, and the soft underbelly of the city, its harbor front, was sealed against attack. Many an enemy fleet that dreamed of forcing its way into the Golden Horn found its path barred by that great chain, and turned away baffled, and the harbor slept safe behind its iron gate. The sea gave the city more than trade and defense. It gave it food, and it gave it beauty, and it gave it that particular quality of light and air that belongs only to places where the land meets great moving water. The straits around Constantinople teemed with fish, so much so that in their season the great shoals came through the channel in numbers beyond counting, and the fishermen of the city hauled in their nets heavy with the silver harvest of the sea, feeding the vast population from the abundance of the waters that surrounded them. From the walls and the palaces and the terraces of the city, one looked out always upon the sea, upon the blue channel with its endless traffic of sails, upon the far Asian shore across the water, upon the play of light on the waves at dawn, and the gold of the sun sinking into the water at evening. Ships came and went upon it at every hour, gulls wheeled above it, and the sound of the water and the smell of the salt were woven into every day of the city's life. Constantinople was a jewel set in the sea, and the sea was its moat, and its highway, and its larder, and its glory, all at once. The great blue element that flowed around the city and carried its wealth and its power out to the ends of the earth. For century upon century, the city that all the world wanted had turned back everyone who came to take it. Persians and Avars, Arabs and Bulgars, and Rus, army after army, and fleet after fleet had broken upon its walls and its fire and its sea. And always the city had endured, secure in the belief that it was watched over by heaven and could never truly fall. But the deep truth of the city's story is a gentle and a sobering one. And it is this, that in the end, the thing which brought the great city low came not from its old enemies at all, but from those it had thought its friends. For the wealth and the wonder of Constantinople, which had drawn the longing of the whole world for so long, at last drew the greed of men who wore the same faith as its own people, and who came, in the guise of pilgrims and allies, and turned upon the city, and took it. It happened when a great expedition of Western knights, gathered for a holy war and sailing east by way of the sea, found itself drawn, through a tangle of debts and promises and ambition, to the walls of Constantinople. And there, at last, the unthinkable came to pass. The Western fleets broke the great chain across the harbor, and the Western knights assaulted the walls from the water side, where the sea defenses were weaker than the mighty land walls, and after hard fighting they broke into the city. And then, for 3 terrible days, the greatest and richest and most beautiful city in the Christian world was given over to sack at the hands of a Christian army. The accumulated treasures of 9 centuries, the art and the gold and the sacred relics gathered from across the world, were plundered and carried off or destroyed. Ancient bronze statues that had stood since the days of the classical world were melted down for their metal. The great churches were stripped of their splendor. It was a wound from which the city, in truth, would never fully recover, a catastrophe that broke the long, proud continuity of its greatness, and it was made all the more bitter by the hands that dealt it. And yet, even then, the city did not die. In time, the exiled heirs of the old empire fought their way back and recovered their capital, and the emperors returned to the palace by the sea, and the life of the city went on. But it went on now diminished, a shadow, in its later centuries, of the mighty capital it had once been. The empire that ruled from it had shrunk, its provinces lost, its wealth spent, its strength worn away by the long attrition of the centuries. The great city grew quieter, and poorer, and emptier, whole districts within the vast circuit of the walls falling into decay, gardens and fields spreading where crowded quarters had once stood. The queen of cities had grown old. And beyond the frontiers, a new and rising power was gathering, which would in time complete the story, and after one last great and famous siege, the city that Constantine had founded would pass, at last, out of the hands of the heirs of Rome, and into the keeping of a new empire, and a new age. But even that ending, when it came, was not truly an ending, and this is a thing worth holding on to as our story draws toward its close. For the city did not vanish, as Petra had vanished into the sand. It did not fall silent and empty and forgotten. It went on living, under new rulers and a new faith, as one of the great cities of the world, its harbors as busy as ever, its position as commanding, its beauty undiminished. The great dome of the Hagia Sophia still floated above the rooftops, preserved and honored, and floats there yet, after nearly 1,500 years, one of the most beautiful things human hands have ever raised. The mighty walls still ran across the landward side, and much of them run there still, worn and broken, but standing. The greatest fortifications of the ancient world enduring into our own. The name of the city changed, and today the world knows it as Istanbul, a mighty modern metropolis of many millions, still standing exactly where Byzas built his little colony and Constantine dreamed his new Rome, still guarding the passage between the seas, still the meeting place of Europe and Asia, still, after all these thousands of years, one of the great cities of the earth. The city the whole world wanted was never, in the end, truly lost. It only changed, and endured, and lives on to this day. Before we come to the end, let us return once more to the great walls, and stand upon them for a while, in the way of a dream, on the night of one of those famous sieges, that we may feel what it was to be one of the defenders of the city in its long centuries of endurance. It is the darkest hour of the night, and you are standing upon the broad walkway atop the great inner wall, high above the sleeping city on one side, and the enemy camp on the other. The night is cool, and a light wind carries the smell of wood smoke in the sea. Behind you and below, the city lies dark and quiet, its countless souls asleep in the shelter of the walls, trusting to the defenders and to God and to the mighty stones beneath your feet. Before you, out across the moat and the outer works, in the darkness of the plain, glimmer the countless fires of the besieging army, spread across the land as far as you can see. A whole world of enemies gathered to take the city. All along the wall, in either direction, stand the other defenders, dim shapes in the starlight, leaning on their spears, watching, waiting. Now and then a low voice murmurs, or a torch flares as the watch is changed, or the soft sound of chanting drifts up from a chapel below, where the monks keep their vigil through the night, praying for the deliverance of the city. You have stood here for hours, and you will stand here until the dawn, and the waiting is the hardest part, the long dark patience of the defender, watching the enemy fires and wondering what the day will bring. But there is a strange peace in it too, a deep calm born of the great solidity of the wall beneath you, the accumulated strength of all those courses of stone laid up by the builders long ago. The knowledge that this same wall has stood against so many enemies through so many nights, and has never yet been broken. And slowly, as you keep your watch, the sky in the east begins to pale. The stars fade one by one. The dark shapes of the towers along the wall harden and take form against the growing light. The enemy fires burn lower, ghostly now in the gathering dawn. And then the sun lifts at last above the far Asian hills across the water, and its light comes flooding across the strait and over the city, catching the great dome of the Hagia Sophia and setting it aglow, running along the tops of the walls, touching the tired faces of the defenders with warmth and gold. Another night has passed, and the city has endured, and the walls have held, as they held yesterday and will hold tomorrow. The enemy may come against them again with the daylight, with their ladders and their engines and their roaring assault. And the day may be long and terrible, but the great walls will stand, and the city will not fall, not this year nor for long ages yet. And behind those walls, the life of the greatest city in the world will go on, its markets opening, its bells ringing, its people waking to another day in the shelter of the fortress that will not break. This was the deep security of Constantinople, the thing that made it more than a city, that made it a kind of promise, that here, behind these stones, the light of the old world would be kept safe, through every dark night of siege, until the dawn. And now let us come down from the walls, and spend, in the quiet of our imagining, one last full day in the city at peace, from the first gray light of dawn to the coming of the stars, letting its gentle rhythms carry us toward sleep. It is very early, and the city is still mostly dark, though the sky above the eastern hills has begun to lighten. The first sound of the day is the sound of bells, the deep bronze voices of the countless churches calling the faithful to the first prayers of the morning, ringing out across the rooftops one after another, until the whole city seems to hum softly with them. Then, as the light grows, the other sounds begin. The crowing of cocks in the gardens, the creak of the first carts, the calls of the fishermen coming in with their night's catch, the slow waking of a great city to another day. As the sun climbs, the city fills with life and light. The markets open along the great avenue, the awnings unrolled, the goods laid out, the merchants calling their wares. The harbors grow busy, ships being loaded and unloaded at the wharves of the Golden Horn, the cranes creaking, the porters bent under their burdens, the whole traffic of the world's trade flowing across the quays. The streets throng with people going about the business of the day, and the smell of baking bread drifts from the ovens, and water runs and splashes in the public fountains. And everywhere the light of the morning sun gleams on marble and gilded roofs and the distant floating dome of the great church. Through the middle of the day the city works and trades and prays and eats, at the very height of its long ascendancy, the busiest and richest place in all the world. In the warm afternoon, the pace of the city softens. In the great public baths, citizens rest and talk, and soak away the labors of the day in the steam and the warm water. That most beloved of Roman pleasures, carried on here in the eastern capital long after it had faded in the west. In the shaded gardens of the palaces and the monasteries, fountains play and birds sing among the trees. And down by the water, all around the edges of the city, people gather in the cool of the sea breeze to look out over the strait, at the ships passing, at the far shore of Asia hazy in the afternoon light, at the endless play of sun on the moving water. The great city breathes slowly in the heat of the day, secure behind its walls, cradled by its sea, going about its ancient life, as it has done for so many hundreds of years. Then the sun begins to sink toward the west, behind the land walls, and the light turns golden, and then rose, and then deep amber, and the whole city is bathed in the soft glory of the evening. The dome of the Hagia Sophia catches the last of the sun and glows like a coal. The waters of the Golden Horn and the Strait turn to sheets of beaten gold, and then to wine dark shadow. The bells ring again for the evening prayers, and the smell of cooking rises from 10,000 hearths, and the people come in from their labors, and the lamps begin to be lit in the windows, small warm points of light appearing one by one all across the darkening city. The markets close, the ships settle at their moorings, the great avenue empties, and a deep quiet begins to settle over the capital as the day draws to its close. And then the night comes on, and the stars appear above the city, above the domes and the towers and the mighty walls, above the dark hills of Asia across the water, wheeling slowly in the vast clear sky. Here and there a light still burns, in a palace window, in a monastery where the monks keep their nightly vigil, in a watchfire on the walls where the guards keep their patient watch over the sleeping city. The sound of the sea comes softly through the dark, the endless lapping of the water against the sea walls, the same sound that has washed against these shores since long before there was any city here at all. And Constantinople, the great city, the queen of cities, the city the whole world wanted, settles into the deep quiet of the night, safe behind its walls, cradled by its sea, watched over by its stars, as it was watched over, night after night, for more than 1,000 years. Now, as our long journey nears its end, let us gather up the threads of the story and ask, one last time, the question with which we began. Why did the whole world want this city so? Why, of all the cities that human beings have ever built, did this one draw to itself the longing and the greed and the ambition of so many peoples across so many centuries? We have walked its streets and stood upon its walls, and we have seen the answer take shape before us, and it is worth holding in the mind as we prepare to let it all fade into sleep. The world wanted Constantinople, first, because of where it stood. From the very beginning, from the day the oracle mocked the blind settlers across the water, the site was simply the finest in the world, the master key to the passage between the seas and the meeting place of the continents, a position of such natural strength and such command of the trade of half the earth, that whoever held it held something close to the keys of the world. The world wanted the city, second, for its wealth, for the river of gold that flowed through it as the goods of 3 continents passed through its markets and its harbors. Wealth so great that the mere sight of it dazzled every visitor who came from the poorer lands beyond. The world wanted it, third, for its beauty and its holiness, for the wonder of its domes and its palaces and its churches, for the shimmering vision of the Hagia Sophia, for the sense every traveler had that here, in this one place, heaven and earth drew close together, and the divine touched the world of men. And the world wanted it, above all, because it seemed so magnificently unattainable, because for 1,000 years the great walls turned every enemy away. And there is nothing that human beings desire so fiercely as the thing that is placed just beyond their reach. The city that could not be taken became, for that very reason, the city that everyone wished to take. But the deepest significance of Constantinople lies not in why it was wanted, but in what its long endurance gave to the world. For 1,000 years and more, the city stood as the great fortress of the eastern edge of Europe, the shield behind which the peoples of the West were given the centuries of shelter they needed to grow. For 1,000 years, it was the great vessel that carried the treasure of the ancient world, the learning and the art and the wisdom of Greece and Rome, safely across the dark and dangerous Middle Ages, so that it might reach the future and kindle new fires of thought and beauty. For 1,000 years, it was the radiant heart of a whole civilization, the mother city of the Eastern Christian world, sending out its faith and its letters and its art to shape whole nations that endure to this day. The city did not merely rise, impossibly, from a rocky point of land into the greatest capital of its age. It rose, and then it stood, through everything, an unbroken thread of light running through the long centuries between the ancient world and the modern one, holding fast to a precious inheritance and passing it on. When we marvel at the impossible rise of Constantinople, we are marveling not only at what one determined emperor built in a few short years, but at what 100 generations of its people preserved and defended across 1,000 years, and at the countless ways, seen and unseen, that their long endurance shaped the world that we ourselves have inherited. And there is one more thing to hold, gentler than all the rest. The city is still there. Unlike so many of the great cities of the ancient world, which fell and were abandoned and swallowed by the sand or the jungle or the sea, Constantinople never died. It changed its rulers and its faith, and even its name, but it never ceased to be a living, breathing, mighty city, and it stands there yet, at the meeting place of the continents, guarding the passage between the seas, exactly where it has stood for 1,600 years and more. Its great walls still run across the land. Its great dome still floats above the water. The same sun that Constantine watched rise over the Asian hills still rises there each morning over one of the largest cities on the earth. The impossible city rose, and it endured. And it endures still. And there is something in that unbroken persistence, that refusal to vanish, that is deeply and quietly consoling, as though to say that some things, once truly made, need never entirely pass away. Think for a moment, before we let the story go, of all the lives that were lived within those walls, across all those long centuries. 1,000 years is a span of time almost too vast for the mind to hold. It is longer than the time that separates us from the age of the great cathedrals. It is many, many lifetimes stacked one upon another, generation after generation after generation, all of them born and living and dying within the shelter of the same great walls, under the same floating dome, beside the same shining water. Think of the countless children who ran through the colonnades of the great avenue and grew up and grew old and were carried at last to their rest, and whose children did the same, and whose children's children, on and on, through century after century, in an unbroken chain of ordinary human lives, each one as real and as full of hope and fear and love as our own. Think of the merchants haggling in the markets, the sailors singing at the oars, the monks bent over their manuscripts in the quiet libraries, the impresses in their silk and gold, the water sellers and the fishermen and the bakers and the guards upon the walls. Think of the mothers rocking their babies to sleep in the little houses beneath the great domes, singing the same soft songs that mothers have always sung, while the sea whispered against the walls and the stars wheeled overhead. Think of the lovers who met in the shadow of the columns, the old friends who argued in the wine shops, the priests who prayed, and the scholars who studied, and the ordinary people who simply lived, day by day, in the greatest city in the world, most of them never knowing that they were part of something that would be remembered and wondered at for ages to come. They thought, as we think, that their own small concerns were the whole of the world. And they are all gone now, every one of them, gone as completely as the morning mist, their names forgotten, their faces lost, their voices silent, and yet the city they made, and loved, and lived and died in, endured, and endures. That is the strange and moving thing about a great and long-lived city. It is made of the lives of countless ordinary people, and those people pass away like the leaves of 1,000 autumns, and yet the city they built goes on, gathering up their labor and their love into something that outlasts them all. Every stone of those walls was laid by hands long since turned to dust. Every golden tile in that great dome was set in place by a workman, whose name we will never know. And the sum of all that forgotten labor, all those vanished lives, is the shining city that rose so impossibly from the water and stood so long against the storms of the world. There is a kind of immortality in that, not for any one of them, but for all of them together, their brief lives woven into the long life of the city, their small and forgotten days gathered up into something great and enduring. And perhaps, as we lie here in the quiet dark, there is a comfort to be drawn from that thought, a sense that our own small days, too, however soon forgotten, are woven into something larger than ourselves, and are not, in the end, in vain. And now our long journey through the story of the city is nearly done, and it is time to let it all come gently to rest, and to let yourself come to rest along with it. So let your mind release the details now, one by one, the way you release the cares of the day as sleep draws near. Let the emperors and the sieges and the dates and the names blur softly together and drift away. You need hold on to none of it. Keep only the feeling of the place, the great city rising from the water, the domes catching the light, the walls standing patient and strong, the endless blue current flowing past between the two sleeping continents. Let your thoughts go back, one last time, to where we began, to that quiet gray hour before the dawn, when you stood at the very tip of the peninsula, at the meeting place of the waters. Stand there again now, in the stillness, and feel the cool air on your face, and smell the salt of the sea. The great sheltered harbor curves away to your left, its water dark and calm. The swift channel runs before you, and across it the hills of Asia wait for the sun. And behind you, rising along the hills, the city sleeps, its domes and towers and mighty walls dim shapes in the last of the darkness, patient and silent, as they have waited through so many thousand dawns. There is nowhere you need to be. There is nothing you need to do. There is only the water, and the coming light, and the great city breathing softly in its sleep. And as you stand there, let the sky begin to pale, slowly, gently, as it has done every morning for 1,600 years and more. Watch the stars fade, one by one, into the growing light. Watch the dark shapes of the domes and the walls soften and take form against the brightening sky. And then, at last, let the sun lift above the far hills across the water, and let its light come flooding golden across the strait and over the city, running up the walls and along the rooftops, kindling the great dome of the Hagia Sophia into a coal of glowing gold, touching the whole sleeping city with warmth and light. Another dawn has come to Constantinople, as so many thousands have come before, and the city wakes, unhurried, into another day of its long life. And here in this quiet dawn, let this be the gentle thought you carry down into sleep. The people who built this city, and the 100 generations who lived and loved and labored within it, are all of them gone now, their days as brief as our own, their worries and their triumphs long since faded into silence. And yet what they made together endured, and endures, rising still from the water at the meeting of the worlds. The small anxieties that filled their days, that felt to them as heavy and as urgent as ours feel to us, have passed away entirely, forgotten utterly, as though they had never been. But the beauty they raised, and the courage they showed, and the patient love with which they built and defended their city across 1,000 years, that remained. And perhaps there is a comfort in that for you tonight, as you lie here in the dark. Perhaps the cares that press upon you now, that seem so large in the small hours of the night, will one day drain away as gently as all the cares of that great city have drained away into the past, leaving behind only what truly mattered. Perhaps you can set them down, just for tonight, and trust the long, slow, patient turning of time to carry them away. There is nothing you must solve before you sleep. There is nothing you must decide, and nothing you must hold. The city stood for 1,000 years without your watching, and it stands there still. The sun has risen over those waters countless times without your help, and it will rise again tomorrow. And there is a deep peace to be found in remembering how small our troubles truly are against the vast, slow sweep of time. How briefly we each keep our watch upon the walls before the dawn comes and another takes our place. You are one quiet life among the countless lives that have looked out over that shining water. And that is not a lonely thought, but a gentle one. For it means you may lay your burdens down now and rest, knowing that the great world will go on turning softly, without any need of your watchfulness through the night. So let your breathing slow, and let it deepen. Let your body grow heavy and warm and still, sinking down into the quiet. Let the last images of the great city fade gently into the dark, the golden dome dimming, the walls softening into shadow, the blue water growing still, the whole shining city drifting away into sleep. There is nothing left to do tonight but rest. The story is told. The dawn has come and gone. The city sleeps at the meeting of the seas, safe behind its walls, as it has slept through so many thousand nights. And now you may sleep too, as deeply and as peacefully as the ancient city itself, carried down gently into the dark and the quiet and the rest that you have more than earned. Thank you for spending this quiet time with me here on Lanternlight Chronicles. If you are still awake, you may simply let these words fade and follow the story down into sleep whenever you are ready. And if ever you find yourself awake again on some other night, looking for something calm to carry you toward rest, I will be here, and there will be another long and gentle story waiting, and another lost world or shining city to wander through together in the dark. Until then, from the great city at the meeting of the seas, and the quiet water, and the slow and patient stars, I wish you nothing but stillness, and comfort, and peace. Rest now. Let everything be quiet. And I wish you a calm and peaceful night.